Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh-Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya studios. These are our top stories. Crucial third-round talks take place between the US and Iran in Geneva as an enormous American military fleet builds up in the Middle East. Meanwhile, Ukraine and Russia hold a new round of peace discussions despite Russia's overnight attack on Kiev and Kharkiv. And all eyes are on the Clintons as Hillary Clinton faces a House Oversight Committee investigating the network and influence of late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Now, Germany and China are pledging to deepen cooperation and strengthen ties as Chancellor Friedrich Merz makes his first official visit to Beijing. Berlin is seeking closer engagement with Beijing at a time of global economic uncertainty and shifting geopolitical tensions. Jan David has this report.
Germany and China are signalling a reset. Chancellor Merz sat down with China's President Xi Jinping for the first time since taking office on Wednesday. The talks in Beijing come as both countries, the largest economies in their region, seek stability in trade and diplomacy amid growing geopolitical turmoil. Xi Jinping says closer coordination between them is increasingly important as international tensions rise.
The more turbulent and intertwined the world becomes, the more China and Germany need to strengthen strategic communication and enhance strategic mutual trust.
He says he values relations with Germany as a key partner within the European Union. Last year, trade between them was worth about 300 billion. It's a precious relationship for Germany too. Beijing is its largest trading partner, and Merz is looking to strengthen ties. Beijing says it hopes to expand what it calls practical cooperation between the two countries. On the second day of his visit, Merz toured Beijing's Forbidden City, highlighting the diplomatic nature of a trip focused on rebuilding dialogue. Underscoring his economic priorities, the Chancellor is travelling with a large business delegation and visited a Mercedes-Benz facility in Beijing. China is critical to Germany's auto industry, accounting for roughly a third of global sales for German car makers. This complicates Europe's goal of de-risking ties with Beijing as it looks to reduce over-reliance on Chinese demand. Merz's visit follows a series of outreach efforts by Western leaders looking to stabilize ties with Beijing. Analysts say engagement between Berlin and Beijing could influence the broader direction of EU-China relations. The German leader will travel to the eastern city of Hangzhou for further meetings with business and political leaders before heading back to Europe. Jan David, Al Arabiya English.
Now to our top story, and the US and Iran have met in Geneva for a third round of talks as President Trump continues his threat to attack if a nuclear deal is not reached. US naval forces have been deployed to the Middle East, with Iran vowing to respond if a strike takes place. Iran has refused US demands to stop the enrichment of uranium. I'm now joined by Patrick Burry, Senior Associate Professor in Security at the Department of Politics, Languages and International Studies at the University of Bath. Professor Burry, pleasure to have you on the show. First of all,
good afternoon.
Afternoon to you too. What do you think happens in the next 24 hours?
Oh, well, I think, obviously these negotiations, we don't even have an understanding of what's coming out of them. I mean, these are emergency negotiations, and what people are probably talking about is a halting of an enrichment on the Iranian side in return for some sort of change to the sanctions arrangement. Mm-hmm. And of course, the sticking point has always been, even when you get into the detail of what they potentially, how far they've advanced or not, the sticking point is the sequencing of that. And and the West and the US saying, well, we're not going to lift the sanctions unless you're transparent that you stopped the program, and the Iranians saying, well, we're not going to stop the program until you. So that's probably the immediate 24 hours. I don't think there'll be strikes or anything in 24 hours as a result of this. As Trump has said, this could go on. He's hoping that they'll come to the table, and maybe in months there could be strikes. There's also the question of, is the US military, although they've moved a lot more of their naval assets and air assets into the region, are they ready as well in terms of stockpiles supporting those assets for what could be a prolonged war if they did decide to strike Iran?
Yeah, I feel like there's more questions than answers at the moment when it comes to the story, as you did outline there, Professor. But the US Vice President J.D. Vance says the US has seen evidence that Iran is trying to rebuild its nuclear capacity. How serious is that allegation? Because, of course, the Trump administration has been very firm that it destroyed those sites during the last round of violence that we saw.
Yeah, and both can be right, really, if you think about it. If there was enriched uranium, so obviously we know, like the nuclear power plant, the civilian enrichment is about 3 to 5%. Anything that's over 20% is seen as moving into high risk. And the reports are, that, so we see open source, is that Iran had been up to 60%. And obviously weapons grade is 90%. And so I think the issue for the Americans is, listen, if you've got some of your 60% managed to survive these strikes and have some other way of processing or whatever, we just don't know here what the intelligence is, then the breakout speed is really quite rapid. And I think that's what, so both can actually be right, and it just depends on whether there's other ways that they can enrich that uranium. So that's the issue at hand. We can clearly see, I think, at the moment that the US moving of these assets into the region, as Trump has said, is basically military signaling for leverage to try to get a deal. I don't think he wants to go to war, but I think, as he said himself, if it becomes to a choice between war or letting Iran getting a nuclear weapon, I think he may choose war in that case.
So, given ongoing nuclear talks and repeated stalemates that we've seen, what specific actions would Iran and the US need to take to rebuild mutual trust? Now, my understanding is this remains one of the core issues because, of course, last time, Professor, when these talks were being held, the US did strike Iran.
Yes, and as I mentioned in the first question, this is really about sequencing and transparency and trust building measures. So it would be, they'll be looking, can we get IAEA inspectors in there? Will you show us where the uranium enrichment is? Will you let us see the facilities, etc.? So it's more transparency so that we understand that, as you continually say, this is a civilian enrichment program. Well, it's not, because the intelligence as we know it assesses they've already gone beyond that. Strategically, it makes a lot of sense for Iran the regime to try to get a nuclear weapon. Of course it does. And in return for that, then you would start to see potential stage lifting of sanctions. So that's what it's going to, the nub of it is going to be about, this transparency, this assessment, the ability to kind of build trust in that way. And there is no trust. This is a very serious issue of which there is no trust. But I'm not really a nuclear programs expert, if you know what I mean. I would leave that for the people who got the real detail on the weapon systems and what needs to be done there. What I would say, though, is at the moment, the US does have enough forces there to act as leverage against Iran. And the Iranians seem to be still thinking, I'm not sure they're actually serious. They're viewing it very much in a diplomatic leverage view it this way. We've both seen each side, or the Iranians recently conduct drills and reports again that they're just seeking Chinese hypersonic missiles, which would pose a threat. We don't know if we have them yet, but there are some reports that they've been to China to look for these anti-ship ballistic missiles, some of which are hypersonic and do pose a significant threat to the large aircraft carriers. But I think that capability, unless there's some surprise, is probably a while off, according to those reports.
Yes, those reports yesterday did appear to say that they may be a while off, but discussions have been happening for 2 years. But considering Iran's domestic unrest and protests, how might internal political pressures actually influence Tehran's negotiation strategy and willing to compromise with the US? Because I think this is a big question, because right now, Iran is walking a pretty tightrope.
It is walking a tightrope. You know, it's lost its image of the strong man in the region, essentially, because of the clashes with Israel and the way it was compromised and the way a lot of the leadership has been taken out and the services have been penetrated, etc. And then, of course, the strikes in June 2025 against its nuclear facilities by the US. So I think it is walking this tight line, and it's really well that you raise it, because internally, that although they've brutally suppressed the essential rebellion that was happening over the last 6 weeks or so, does that mean that they feel that they need to cut a deal, that the regime is insecure, and they're better off cutting a deal with the US now? It seems to be the foreign minister, as of yesterday, said they're keen to cut a deal. So, as you point out, that is probably a correct way of reading it today. Although they've managed to suppress it, and there's been no elite defections, which is always a key thing to see if you're going to assess whether a regime stays in power or not. The fact that they're looking for a deal does suggest, as you say, that potentially they're feeling that they need to kind of draw a line under this pause and basically bolster the regime, that they can't be faced with a war essentially on two fronts. It's really interesting to see what happens as the US increases its military posture. Does any more protests happen inside Iran? Because the US military and Trump were essentially late during the last uprising because of Venezuela, and they didn't have enough stuff there. So they now got their posture sorted out to a greater degree. Does this prompt anything inside Iran? That would be very interesting indeed.
Yes, indeed. And just one final thought from you, if you don't mind, Professor. If negotiations fail or produce only a limited agreement, how could this actually change security dynamics in the Middle East, particularly regarding the risk of military escalation between the US, Iran, and their regional allies?
Well, I think the US has kind of three options. So you're saying if this was to go to war, the usual pattern here is sort of kicking the can down the road, some sort of agreement, which is then broken. And we've been in that for years. And so to say that won't continue, and each time there's a greater risk of Iranian breakout, but to say it won't continue, that's the pattern that it's been so far. So let's see. But if it was to end and the US has decided to strike, they'd have three options. Obviously targeting the regime, the top of the regime. We've seen that's been effective before. Targeting the IRGC and the military across their command centers, their control, their bases, and then finally hitting nuclear targets again, of course. And it can be, those aren't mutually exclusive. It could do all three. And the way it would do that, of course, would first of all be trying to take out what's left of Iranian air defenses. There's some reports that maybe they've got new stuff from the Russians. We'd have to wait and see, but that would be their first goal. And then their second goal, once they do that, of course, because of the risk, as you rightly say, to the region, and especially Israel, would be to identify and destroy especially the mobile and the static ballistic missile launchers. And once they do that, then they've kind of got the Iranian major threat contained. Of course, the Iranians then can hit back with proxies. They can hit back with terrorism inside the West. They can do stuff in the Strait of Hormuz, as we well know. So it's not as if they can't, retaliate, but it would be the interaction effect of what the US is trying to stop, the major threat probably being the ballistic missiles in the short term.
Professor Patrick Barry, let's see what happens in the next 24 hours. But thank you so much for joining me. Meetings will also take place between Kiev and Washington today in an attempt to bring an end to Russia's 4-year-long war with Ukraine. It follows overnight strikes by Moscow, which injured 20 people in Ukraine's eastern and southern regions. It's believed the Kremlin's economic affairs envoy, Kirill Dimitrov, will also be in the Swiss city today, although not invited to the meeting with Ukraine's lead negotiator and Trump's envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. I'm now joined by Ambassador Dmitry Polyanskiy, permanent representative of the Russian Federation to the OSCE. Ambassador, it's been great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for your time. I just want to begin by asking you, President Zelenskyy says 420 drones and 39 missiles were launched into Ukraine last night, hitting Ukrainian infrastructure. How does Russia justify large-scale strikes on energy and civilian systems while claiming to support peace talks and go to these negotiations?
Well, first of all, you need to look a little bit into the history of last year, when there was this proposal of President Trump for energy truce, which was immediately upheld by Russia. And we introduced this truce for as long as 1 month. But Zelenskyy didn't want to do the same, so he violated it. He never said that he would be adhering to this truce. And since then, he has been escalating, saying that Ukraine is capable to hit targets in Russian territory, energy targets, infrastructure targets. He wanted to show, and he still wants to show, that Ukraine is capable to inflict damage to Russia, which would, in his calculations, be an incentive for his sponsors to increase financing, to kind of believe in Ukraine, all these things. So, as a retaliation, we had to start these strikes, and the strikes by Zelenskyy regime were severe, especially severe at the end of last year, beginning of this year. And actually, there has never been any talk about stopping this from regime of Zelenskyy, only about escalation. So we have to retaliate. And of course, we have to diminish the military and industrial potential of the Kiev regime, which is being regularly furnished by his sponsors of weapons and finances and whatever. So we are in fact dealing with the whole NATO military machine there in Ukraine. We have to do it in order to achieve the goals of our special military operation, in order to make Ukraine agree to very clear and obvious things for us: equal rights for everybody, guarantees of rights of Russian speakers and Russian language, abolishing of the practice of heroization of Nazi criminals, respect of freedom of religion, freedom of belief, of freedom of media, everything that is natural for any other country in the world, except for Ukraine. And Ukraine is the only one that has legally banned Russian language, despite the fact that there is a provision in the Ukrainian constitution which guarantees the rights of Russian speakers.
Ambassador, sponsors, I imagine you're meaning European countries who are supporting Ukraine and NATO countries. I just want to make that clear for our audience who's watching the show at the moment. Who do you mean by Ukrainian sponsors?
Those who finance Ukraine right now, and the clear obligation, clear commitment to continue to sponsor Ukraine, to provide it with arms, intelligence, whatever, were given by European Union and NATO first and foremost. And
by the US, of course, who you are holding negotiations
with. The US is not selling the weapons to Ukraine, I think, directly now. There is a change of tactics, as far as I understand. So they are selling it to NATO, and NATO is to buy it. But the United States made it clear that they continue to do it insofar there is no agreement reached these trilateral negotiations, which they hope that will be there.
So Ukraine is seeking $800 billion in reconstruction funds as they meet US officials in Geneva today. Will Russia contribute to rebuilding the damage caused by its military campaign over this 4-year period? Or do you think Russia thinks other people should pay the cost?
Well, it's hard for me to comment the course of negotiations between Ukraine and the United States. I represent neither one of them. I have a question: who will compensate, who will finance the reconstruction of the territories that were pillaged by Ukraine since 2014 in the east of the country, which is absolutely demolished since then? I think nobody is asking this question. Who will compensate and who will finance the damage to Russian border regions, which are being all the time targeted by Ukrainian attacks, first and foremost the Kursk Oblast, the Belgorod Oblast, and the others. So it's not the only question that should be solved. I think that the discussion on these economic issues will continue and they have their special formats. And I wouldn't oversimplify these matters and to portray them as black and white.
Ukrainian and Russian negotiators met last week in Geneva for their third US-mediated meeting this year. You did mention it to me. Obviously, it appears to be at a stalemate. No resolution has been reached. What concrete concessions is Russia willing to make to break this deadlock? Because what I'm hearing time and time again from Donald Trump is he wants to stop the killing. He wants to stop the death. And as this war grinds on, more people from the Russian side are dying as well as the Ukrainian side.
I don't think we should qualify these negotiations as being in a deadlock, because they're going to continue, and there is no doubt about it. Although I haven't heard about any concrete date or venue for the resumption of the negotiations. So they are now in the middle of this process, and I would avoid any substantial comments there of what is being discussed and what can be the outcome. As far as concession, well, I can tell you that the biggest concession from Russia, these negotiations, is that Russia is ready to consider implementing the goals of its special military operation with diplomatic means and not with military means. So we're ready to stop this special military operation, provided, of course, there are enough of conditions met by Ukraine that would absolutely rule out any possible further threats there to my country, and also that would guarantee the respect for the right of Russian speakers and all other human rights.
French President Emmanuel Macron called Russia's war a triple failure. How do you respond to the claim that the conflict has strengthened NATO and united Europe against Russia? And I found it really interesting. He said it was a triple failure because now Russia's economy is sinking. They've also had huge casualty numbers, and NATO's united.
Well, actually, I think that's the best illustration of the expression wishful thinking. And of course, they want to look upbeat and to take the upbeat tune while describing this whole situation. But, well, for anyone who visited Moscow, it's absolutely clear that Russia has benefited very much from this situation when it had to rely on its forces, its economic might, and to seek partners elsewhere. And Moscow is booming, Russian economy is booming. It's very hard to understand what are the reasons for President Macron to make such conclusions. As for unity of EU and NATO, well, I don't think you need even to comment, because there are a lot of different opinions, and many countries are now starting to take away these rosy glasses and to propose of how to engage with Russia, because this was absolutely detrimental to the bloc, and both to the EU and to NATO, and it's indeed their economies are suffering. As for number of casualties, well, you know, there have been speculations about it all the time, and it's very hard for me to comment. But I can just make a reference to you that today there was another exchange of bodies between between Russia and Ukraine, and Ukraine received 1,000 bodies of their soldiers, and Russia, I think, about 25 or 30. So that's the proportion of the last maybe 10 or 15 exchanges. I think it speaks volumes about the real number of casualties on Russian and Ukrainian side.
And as you do say, Ambassador, very difficult to know the number of casualties, but the Centre for Strategic and International Studies says Russia has suffered more casualties and fatalities than any other major power in any war since World War II. Russian forces suffered nearly 1.2 million battlefield casualties. Ukraine forces likely suffered somewhere between 500,000 and 600,000. But as you say, it's difficult to know, but that's what we're getting from the Centre for Strategic.
That's very doubtful figure. I really don't know where the sources. President Zelenskyy, for example, says that Ukraine has lost 55,000 people. I think that in this situation, the numbers become also the tools of propaganda and the hybrid war against Russia. So I wouldn't really trust such conclusions. We will know it all later. But I gave you the idea of what is the proportion in accordance of real facts.
And Ambassador, Russia claims Britain and France are preparing to supply Ukraine with nuclear weapons. Can you provide us with credible evidence to support this? And what will Russia do in response if this is the case?
That was the issue that we raised today at the Permanent Council of the OSCE, by the way. And this information is provided by the Russian intelligence service, and we trust, of course, our intelligence service. I recall that your previous speaker was referring to some kind of intelligence about Iranian nuclear program, and you never doubted his conclusions, the conclusions of this intelligence. So I think we should trust intelligence people, and they were serious to the extent that they published a special communique on their website enumerating not only this threat, but also the possible weapon that is thought to be transferred to Ukraine and the way of delivery of this weapon. And this is very serious indeed. So I think that if intelligence makes such a thing, then you really should trust it. And we believe that if this trend continues, if there is a real desire to transfer nuclear weapons to Ukraine in order to create some kind of nuclear arms or to make some dirty bomb, as we say, then of course it will trigger adequate response from the Russian side in accordance to our nuclear strategy, and this will be a very powerful and overwhelming response. Of course, we don't want to think about it. We hope that the minds will cool down and they will just look at this problem through the lens of the interests of the whole world, because there will be no limited nuclear conflict. And, well, what can I say? It's very hard to comment the proofs that intelligence provides, but for me, this information is really worth taking account of, and it's very much welcome if the public organizations, parliamentarians, investigative journalists, society as a whole make pressure and investigation on those who are carrying out such plans, because this is really something that would be very dangerous for the whole of mankind.
Ambassador, one final thought before I let you go. Shouldn't Ukraine be allowed to have a nuclear weapon, considering Russia has so many and they need to protect themselves?
Absolutely not, and this is the core idea of the NPT treaty, which is the backbone of world security and stability. And of course, I can't even imagine what Ukraine would have done with nuclear bomb if Zelenskyy is using everything to provoke Russia and to kind of make his case prevail, to grasp to power and to be left there as Ukrainian president at any price. I can imagine that he would, of course, use this nuclear blackmail to further push his country into misery and to make his countrymen suffer.
Ambassador Dmitry Polyanskiy, so good to have you on the show. Thank you so much for your time with me.
Thank you. Thank you.
North Korean leader Kim Jong Un has called on the United States to respect his country's nuclear power, sending a defiant message to Washington. Kim told the US they would get along if they accepted that North Korea's nuclear weapons are here to stay. It's believed North Korea has around 50 nuclear warheads and is looking to produce more. Let's get the thoughts of Professor Derek Grossman from the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Southern California. A bit of a theme in my show today. It seems to be about nuclear. And Derek, we're going to talk about some more. So we heard directly from North Korea's leader. How rare and significant were Kim Jong Un's comments?
It's good to be with you again. And I think it's very rare that you hear directly from Kim Jong Un with quotation marks around his statements. And oh, by the way, he talked at length about how North Korea is a nuclear power, how South Korea can no longer be trusted, and the United States, basically future negotiations rely squarely upon the United States cultivating a positive relationship with the North and accepting the fact that North Korea is a nuclear power. And so I think this was quite rare. And it was also interesting to see that the Russia and China angles were virtually non-existent at the Ninth Party Congress. I mean, as we all have been following, North Korea has a very close relationship with Russia, especially in dealing with Ukraine, going back to your last speaker. And also, it's reset its relationship with China, and yet there was very little conversation about them specifically, other than North Korea would continue to align itself with anti-imperialist forces. And so the situation, I think, overall is a North Korea emboldened, and it's going to be very difficult for the Trump administration to re-engage if it so chooses.
So Kim Jong Un stated that North Korea is willing to have peaceful relations with the US, but only if Washington accepts the permanence of their nuclear arsenal. And Derek, do you think Trump will have any interest in talks? Remember, the two men did meet in Hanoi back in Donald Trump's first term. Or do you think he just won't be interested because now it seems like the rules of the negotiation terms have been changed?
I do think Trump's interested in re-engaging. If you notice during the State of the Union address, he mentioned Iran, he mentioned Venezuela, he didn't mention North Korea. And in fact, the national security strategy and the national defense strategy are very light on North Korea, if they even mention North Korea by name at all. And so I think this is very much about optics, keeping a positive environment, which is in line with what Kim Jong Un wants. Also, Trump views other leaders in very personal terms. And of course, he has referred to Kim Jong Un as not just Rocket Man, but Little Rocket Man, which he thought was actually a compliment. And apparently Kim didn't really appreciate. Okay, but nonetheless, he also said that Kim and Trump and Kim wrote each other love letters and fell in love. Okay, so this is a relationship that I think Trump does not want to see die on the vine. And you mentioned that they met in Hanoi in February of 2019, but also Trump became the first sitting president to step foot into North Korea and meet with the North Korean leaders. So there's a lot of personal baggage here, I think in a good way. But the problem for Trump is that Kim is now much more strongly aligned with China and Russia. And so there's going to be, I think, less appetite from Kim to negotiate with Trump. He's really going to look for sanctions relief first before they talk about Kim Jong Un's nuclear program at all.
Derek, I'll never forget when Donald Trump sent that tweet out calling Kim Jong Un Little Rocket Man. I felt like that was the beginning of this bromance that you're talking about, really. But last night, Kim also labelled its neighbour, South Korea, as the most hostile entity. As we know, the Korean Peninsula is considered one of the most dangerous and volatile regions in the whole world. Do you think we can expect any escalation on the Korean Peninsula after these comments from the North Korean leader?
So I think that we should not expect a high risk of conflict. In fact, Kim has said similar things in the past. I mean, the regrettable part of this is that in 2018, North Korea and South Korea were directly negotiating with each other. In fact, the president of South Korea at the time, Moon Jae-in, not only met with Kim at the demilitarized zone, the border between North and South Korea, but also went to North Korea to meet with Kim. And so hopes were very high. And here we are 8 years later, and we're getting comments like this from Kim. So that's unfortunate and that's worrisome. But at the same time, I think Kim is very rational. He has, of course, launched missiles in the past. He's done nuclear tests, but he has never sought to invade South Korea, as far as we can tell. There have been incidents, especially early on in Kim's tenure, such as the shelling of Waipido Island, controlled by South Korea, as well as a North Korean submarine attack against a South Korean Navy ship. So there have been some limited attacks, but those are very far in the rearview mirror at this point, 15 plus years ago. And that, I think, was when Kim was consolidating power. He is now large and in charge and doesn't really need to prove himself within his own system. And I will say that his track record over the last at least decade has been fairly cautious and restrained, in fact. Now, the one wild card is if he has this emboldened relationship, he has a stronger relationship with Russia, and now he's more emboldened to do those types of risky attacks, then that could be another story, and it's something we got to keep watch of in the future.
I always find talking about North Korea absolutely fascinating. Professor Derek Grossman, thank you so much. So much more I could have asked you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Now, former US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton will appear before the House Oversight Committee today as part of a congressional investigation into Jeffrey Epstein. Her husband, of course, President Bill Clinton, will provide evidence tomorrow. The Clintons, who initially resisted being involved with the case, will testify in their hometown of Chappaqua in New York, and that will all be behind closed doors. Now, let's go live to Washington to speak to our correspondent there, Sara Firth. Sara, great to have you on. Hillary Clinton, she's of course arrived. What more do we know? And what can we expect from today's testimony?
Yes, Leigh-Ann, Hillary Clinton has arrived. She is testifying before US House lawmakers. As you pointed out, it's taking place in New York. So although you've got it happening before this Congressional Oversight Committee, they said they made that accommodation to have the questioning take place near the Clintons' homes. So she has arrived and she's posted her opening statement that she's given to those US House lawmakers. In her opening statement, she posted it to social media. This is what she said, Leigh-Ann. She said, "I had no idea about Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell's criminal activities." She says, "I do not recall ever encountering Mr. Epstein." And she shared that statement publicly. Expect her to then be questioned pretty thoroughly by the House Oversight Committee. They are looking, they say, to try and establish just how Jeffrey Epstein was able to operate within this ecosystem of power and influence, how he was able to carry out some of those crimes. We know that her husband, former President Bill Clinton, he has been named in the Epstein files. There are photographs included. It's been documented, his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Hillary Clinton, for her part, has said she had no relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. And so the House committee has made it clear they're going to be focused, for example, on the ties between Jeffrey Epstein and his involvement and Ghislaine Maxwell's involvement with the Clinton Foundation. So looking at that kind of charity network, looking at that sphere of influence. Hillary Clinton saying ahead of the testimony in an interview, "We have nothing to hide." She's made that very clear. But Leigh-Ann, the first time in history that you've had a former First Lady and tomorrow a former president being compelled to provide testimony before a congressional committee in this way. So it's a huge break with usual precedent and very, very unusual indeed. And Hillary Clinton also going on to say when she announced that they would be testifying in this way, they're not going to like what I have to say, she said. I've got very strong opinions about who they're trying to protect. She said that the fact that herself and her husband have been called to testify in this way is to, she alleges, distract from President Trump.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just seeing a news line come out right now, and we can hear what Hillary Clinton is accusing officials of Trump cover-up as she testifies in this Epstein case and investigation. But so interesting. But Sarah, we have seen significant fallout from the release of these Epstein files already, especially a lot of people say in Britain, in the UK. Could there actually be more to come, do you think?
Yes, I mean, the shadow cast by the release of those Epstein files and the crimes committed by Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell continue to fall over the business elite, politicians, philanthropists. You've got Washington absolutely shaken here at the moment by what is occurring on the other side of the Atlantic. Of course, you've had major consequences for critical figures involved in the Epstein files and named in the Epstein files. And Leigh-Ann, we always say, don't we, that being named in the files doesn't mean wrongdoing. And again, the Congressional Committee chair, James Comer, he said ahead of this, look, I want to make clear that the Clintons aren't being accused of wrongdoing, but he did say that he feels that Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton's statements that they've made about their knowledge of Jeffrey Epstein's crime and their involvement with him perhaps haven't been as transparent as they could be. So that's what James Comer and that committee are going to be pushing for when they have this testimony that's now underway. Hillary Clinton, for her part, Leigh-Ann, she is very battle-hardened when it comes to answering questions in this type of manner. She appeared when she was former Secretary of State. She testified, giving information ahead of a select committee about what took place in Libya. That was an 11-hour marathon session. So she is well versed in answering these difficult questions and in managing, in some regards, the narrative around this. She'll be trying very hard, it's expected, to try and keep the focus away from the relationship her husband had, making clear what knowledge she had and what instances she did have crossing paths with Ghislaine Maxwell, for example. But she will also be, as we've already seen, trying to put the focus on President Trump. And we know she's already said, look, his name appears countless times in the Epstein files. There's ongoing controversy about whether the Department of Justice, with those redactions, has actually followed the letter of the law and been as transparent as they were compelled by law to be. And that's ongoing at the moment, Leigh-Ann. So expect potentially some fireworks of that testimony today from Hillary Clinton. It is behind closed doors, but we're expecting the transcript and the video to be released pretty immediately afterwards. And then, of course, tomorrow you've got former President Bill Clinton testifying again. The first time in history something like that has happened. So a lot of information expected to be released. And Washington here at the moment, really shook by the continued consequences as a result of the revelations in those Epstein files.
Sara Firth, thank you so much. Great to have you on the show. And that's all from us on W News. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Of course, follow us on X. And we'll be back in a couple of hours with W News Extra. Goodbye and thank you.